Today we're going to cover AI data center depreciation. I know, everybody's favorite topic, but I see so many things wrong with the discussion about this that I just had to make a video about this. Welcome to Black Sheep Investing, where we talk about less covered stories from less covered angles. I found this to actually be an insanely hard topic to cover because it's really, really dry, but also because it's very easy to get lost in the sauce on this kind of subject where I'm trying to paint a bigger picture. Technically speaking, there are minutiae and exceptions to everything I'm about to say. The challenge with this kind of topic is that if I were to cover every single little detail, this would be like a 10-hour video and nobody is going to want to hear that. Let's talk about depreciation from a high level here. And this is a critical thing to cover for the AI bubble because there's so much money being spent on capital. Capital expenditures just for the next year is estimated to be around $500 billion. So let's back this up a bit and let's think about the big picture of what we try to accomplish when we talk about depreciation. Before we jump into Excel, I'm going to explain the three examples I'm about to show you. In the first example, we'll cover a constant revenue stream and we'll see how that perfectly matches with the 6-year linear depreciation that hyperscalers are using typically. Next, we'll cover the linearly decreasing revenue stream example, and we'll see how that starts to introduce significant errors. Third, we'll cover the exponentially decreasing revenue stream, and we'll see how that introduces even larger errors, especially in the short-term first year or two. Finally, I'm going to piece it all together and explain how companies can stack these errors to manufacture profits in the short term where there are actually none. I'm also going to explain my own projections for what I believe the true profitability is, and I think the results might surprise you. I've put together these tables, and you can see that the revenue is constant in the first model, the expenses are constant, and the profit is constant per year. And we have our 6-year GAAP depreciation divided among we're going to assume an H100 and associated equipment for that H100 costs $40,000. And then we'll look at perfect depreciation. Now I've purposefully set this so that the profit exactly offsets the depreciation, meaning there are actually no net profits at the end of this operation. Therefore, any deviation from zero profit is fake profit. Now let's look at how the charts look. Here in the first example, we have a constant revenue, constant expenses, and a constant profit. And we see here that our GAAP profit, which is based on 6-year linear depreciation, shows no profits. And the actual profit, the orange line, is always going to be no profit. Because remember, our asset does not actually have profits. Let's go down to the next example where we have a linearly decreasing revenue and profit line, but constant expenses. And we can see right away we start to see error. So this is where the depreciation is not correct, meaning this part here is much more valuable than this part here. It's generating much more profit. So by the time we reach the halfway point as a sanity check, according to linear depreciation, at the halfway point, we have 50% of the value remaining. Well, you can see very clearly the area under the line, this section here is much smaller than this section here. So the amount of profit remaining is in no way comparable. And that's how we have an overstatement of profits in the beginning because we're not depreciating enough over here. And here, we're depreciating too much. Remember, it has to balance out to zero. Now in the third example, we have an even more extreme exponential decay in revenue and in profit, meaning this part, the front part, is far more profitable than this part where the asset is basically worthless at this point. And here we can see if we compare against example 2, example 3, the first year peaks at $10,000 of fake profits, whereas the linear decay of profit only peaked at about $5,000. And again, it all has to net out. So we see a longer period of depreciation, over depreciation at the end. So if we were an unscrupulous company, you could see how you could manufacture earnings where there actually are none simply by playing games with capital expenditures. The idea here is that you do what I would call a CapEx ladder. So in the first year, you spend on CapEx and you get that fake bump. And then on the second year, right as the first year's CapEx is starting to roll off, you spend even more on CapEx. And so this more than compensates for the roll off in year one's CapEx. And then in the third year, as year one and two's CapEx is rolling off, you do an even bigger bump, and so on. So in this example, I've done 4 years of CapEx bumps. And you can see their depreciation schedules here. And so these are all errors. Remember, there is no actual net earnings at the end of any of this. So you can see these curves, and if we stack them properly, you can see here we get the fake GAAP earnings. And you can see for the first 4 years, it looks like earnings are going up and up and up, but in reality, we're just stacking errors. So we're linearly depreciating an exponentially decreasing asset. And again, there are no actual earnings. This is an illusion. We often see companies like Bitcoin mining companies do this, where every year they just keep increasing CapEx and keep increasing CapEx until eventually they can't increase it anymore and they blow up. Before I get too deep in my results, I want to explain the reason why I chose the H100, even though it's technically 2 generations behind at this point. And it's because it's the oldest real AI first GPU that NVIDIA made. The A100 was released at a time when AI was barely even on the radar and isn't really a fair comparison to modern GPUs for a variety of reasons. Being older has its advantages though, mainly in the data that's available for the H100. While we can only guess what Vera Rubin's rental rates are, we do have some data for the H100. Although the H100's price data is good, it has its own problems that introduce significant error bands in everything I'm about to lay out. The main problem is there's no such thing as a pure H100 rental that we can easily compare across the years, apples to apples. Rental rates today can vary between $1 an hour to over $10 an hour, depending on if you're renting from a low-end online marketplace or a highly networked managed H100 cloud in a dedicated massive data center. I'm going to focus on services that are at the high end of what's called bare metal rentals in the following example. On the very low end, you have random GPUs literally potentially sitting on some random guy's desk being rented in marketplaces like Vast.ai. And on the highest end, you have managed cloud services such as Azure, Google, or AWS. Highly networked, enterprise-grade AI data centers that run bare metal rentals, such as CoreWeave, probably provide the best apples-to-apples price data over time. But even for them, their focus is on selling to hyperscalers, so price data is not very transparent. What sets Microsoft Azure or other hyperscaler cloud services apart from CoreWeave isn't hardware anymore. It's mainly software, which we're not really trying to quantify here. In fact, Microsoft Azure contracts CoreWeave for some of their own Azure capacity, showing that the hardware is not the difference. The rates they're charging public customers are definitely not the rates that are being paid by hyperscalers. What we see from the H100's pricing is probably conservative because it came from an era where GPUs were released once every 2 years. And with Blackwell and now Vera Rubin, NVIDIA has moved to a 1-year release cycle. As such, I expect the depreciation curve to be much steeper for post-H100 GPUs. We're going to talk about the H100 sold at the end of 2024 when NVIDIA was just starting its transition to Blackwell. The reason for this is twofold. As NVIDIA ramped up H100 production greatly, NVIDIA was simply selling a lot more of them towards the end of the window than at the beginning. So the best average H100 probably is one that was sold closer to the end of the window. The other reason is the H100 had an abnormal extreme shortage in the first year, which led to abnormally high rental prices as AI really started to hit the scene. And we did not see this with Blackwell, and wouldn't expect to see it with Vera Rubin or future generations. The final point I want to make is that anyone saying there's going to be a linear decrease or even a flat line revenue is delusional. No technology has that behavior. Whether it's Moore's law, camera densities, memory prices and densities, processors, internet speeds, or literally any technology product I can think of, every single one has followed an exponential curve. You should therefore be extremely skeptical of anyone claiming otherwise, and this is the basis for why linear depreciation is such a ridiculous model for GPU depreciation and leads to the kinds of errors that we saw in our examples. Let's go over my example. Starting with the hourly rate, we're going to assume on year one, the H100 has a $6 per hour rental rate. Year two, it decreases. Year three, it decreases, and so on. For the utilization rate, we're going to assume it's going to be used for training in the beginning. So it's going to have 70% utilization. And then at the third year, it's no longer going to be the most relevant for training. So the next generation, Blackwell, would step in. That should be happening approximately this year. This would be approximately the third year. And for inference, typically we see lower utilization rates. So we would expect about, let's say, 40% utilization, which is considered good for inference. And by the sixth year, the reality is the GPU is just so obsolete at this point. Even for inference, it's much less in demand. Now, uptime, I put 90%. This is based on articles that came out about Meta and how they achieved a 90% uptime rate. I don't think whether it's 90% or 95% or whatever, it does not fundamentally change very much. So we're just going to go with 90% uptime. This is considered best in class for an outfit like a CoreWeave at the upper end of bare metal rentals. Failure rate is an interesting one because it's not something that's discussed a whole lot. There seems to be some sort of impression that NVIDIA is warranting these GPUs for 3 years, but according to various analysis, we find that about 9% fail on year one, and NVIDIA does not have warranty expenses anything close to the failure rates that are reported through analysis by Alphabet or Meta or other outfits. So this is one that I see is really not factored in at all. NVIDIA typically has warranty reserves approximately 1% of their revenues. So there's no way NVIDIA is warranting these with only 1% of revenues dedicated to warranty reserves. I'm under the impression that failures are really the responsibility of the customer. And in NVIDIA's own language, their warranty page states that they're not really intended for large-scale data center use or GPU cluster deployments. And this is because failures rise exponentially with usage rising. So a GPU that's used for, let's say, 10% of the hours of the day is going to fail far, far into the future compared to a GPU that's pegged at 99% utilization constantly. For this analysis, I'm just going to assume a failure rate of 9% per year, which you'll notice doesn't really match up with this column. And the other component I'm going to go over is the repair. So it is possible to repair GPUs. A large part of the GPUs are failing because of the GPUs themselves. Those GPUs can be cannibalized from other GPUs. Okay, so I actually kind of caught this word salad in editing, so I just wanted to clarify. There's GPUs, which are entire assemblies with, a motherboard, memory, all sorts of stuff in there. So people refer to GPUs as the whole thing, but technically speaking, the GPU is just one chip. Well, actually, blades have multiple GPUs. It depends on which generation of product we're talking about. But the point is, what I meant to say was some of them, the GPU die has failed, or one of the GPU dies has failed. And so you can just pick off a good GPU die from another GPU blade assembly and basically just put it onto the one that you're trying to repair. Back to the program. Same with memory. Memory accounts for a significant percentage of the failures. So the memory can also be replaced. And we see reports of very large quantities of H100s making their way to China as repairs, meaning somebody in the mainland US is sending broken H100s over to China through their black market. And these are getting repaired over there and being used in their own data centers. Of course, this is all unknown as far as how big of a scale this is, but it's enough that media has picked up on this, so I'm assuming this is probably not a small number of failures. In my analysis, I'm going to assume that the data centers have their own repair operations and they fix about half of the GPUs that fail. I believe these numbers might actually be pretty conservative. Now, based on all of this, we reach revenue numbers such as these and expense numbers such as these. I'm going to assume that all those repairs cost money. So we're going to add in 5% per year of GPU repair costs. And as OpEx, we're going to use $1 per hour. Now, based on all this, I put together this graph for the actual values. Now, a lot of these numbers are speculative and a lot of them are simply unknown and they can vary site to site. So I don't want to be nailed down to exact numbers, but this is just a general idea of what I think broadly a GPU profitability looks like. And we can see basically that for the first 2 years, it is actually making a real profit. And by the third year, it's pretty much breaking even, and it starts to lose money after that. I also wanted to model the depreciation curves and how they would handle such a situation. So here's the depreciation curves, and you can see all of them overstate in the beginning, even for a 3-year depreciation cycle. But a 6-year one is especially overstating in the beginning. And something I really want to point out is that the capital that I used is about $40,000 for the actual GPU, but something that doesn't get factored in as much is a lot of the switches, electrical, even the plumbing, cooling is actually GPU specific, meaning a Vera Rubin rack of GPUs does not have all the same components outside of their GPU that a Blackwell one does or an H100 one does. It's not like you just pull out the H100 cards and then you just put in the Vera Rubin cards. It does not work like that. They have different energy densities, they have different weights, they have different amounts of coolant. So it's not just like a plug and play replacement. And I believe that the total costs outside of the GPU, including labor for replacement and that sort of thing, the total cost per GPU is probably around something like $50,000. I'm also factoring in building expenses and land and power, etc. And all of that is going to be depreciated correctly in these tables. And one thing you'll note is there's a humongous problem, which is at year 7, the depreciation cost is about $58,000, but the total profit is only $36,000. And this is a very big problem. And this assumes actually after the 3rd year that you don't run the GPU during these later years where it's actually losing money. If you were to do that, you would actually end up with an even worse profit. What this means is that since this 36,000 is less than the 58, this thing is actually losing money. Our prior examples where the profit and the CapEx net out is actually probably optimistic. And this is why reports are so concerning, like the ones that we see of Oracle making a 10% gross margin on the first year based on 6-year linear depreciation when their profits should be the absolute highest. Now, 10% gross margin isn't even enough to cover OpEx. They're not even making a net income on the first year when they should be the most profitable. Notably, not a single hyperscaler is really claiming profitability, even though we're in the best part of their depreciation schedules. It really makes you wonder, in 2 or 3 years, what it's going to be like when the depreciation schedules start to really catch up to them. This gets into a situation where we might be seeing profits today when in reality there won't be any profits. It will not average out to zero even. However, none of the hyperscalers have outright come out and said that they are making a profit, which makes it even more concerning because if they can't even make a profit in year one and year two, where their earnings are being overstated, then how are they supposed to make a profit in a few years? Oftentimes, as investors, we love to hear exact figures quoted from management, but sometimes when they don't say anything, that's also saying something. The fact that none of these hyperscalers are bragging about outright profits, how all of them, without exception, are talking about AI data centers dragging down their gross margins, not boosting them or even maintaining them, this should really be telling us a lot. This unspoken language actually tells us a lot about where we should expect these data center profits to be. And if outfits like Oracle can't even make a net margin on this, then companies like CoreWeave, Nebius, or any of the other neoclouds or bare metal companies that charge even less money are definitely not making any kind of profit from this. First of all, congratulations on making it to the end of this extremely dry video, and I hope to never make another one this dry again. I think the main takeaway from all of this is that I'm extremely skeptical about how these numbers are being calculated. First of all, we know almost by mathematical proof that a linear depreciation schedule does not match reality. I understand that GAAP has rules and companies can't just decide whatever they want. And to be clear, GAAP actually asks you to depreciate based on revenues, not profits. So it's not the company's fault that there are errors here between what I'd consider optimal versus what they're doing. I'm not saying there's necessarily any fraudulent accounting going on here, but I will say that the choosing of linear depreciation over accelerated and 6-year depreciation rather than 3 results in boosting earnings in the short term and is likely in the financial interest of most management teams at these companies. So make of that what you will. The other thing I'll say is that we've seen this kind of depreciation pyramid before. In order to stay ahead of the depreciation curve, especially once returns start going negative on prior investments, companies are forced to spend even more in the future. It becomes this self-reinforcing, almost pyramid-shaped capital expenditures. We've seen this exact pattern with Bitcoin mining companies. They grow and grow and grow until one day they just go bust out of nowhere because their cash flow can no longer support their money-losing operations. The fundamental problem with the Bitcoin miners is that even though they're making more revenue, their capital expenditures are not profitable, and it eventually catches up to them, no matter how much they try to play accounting games. I think the hyperscalers are still a long way from any real solvency risk, and I fully expect them to cut spending on unprofitable AI data centers long before that becomes a serious concern. Unlike Bitcoin miners, these spending numbers, though, are absolutely insane. We're talking about amounts approaching trillions of dollars. And unlike Bitcoin miners, the laws of economics might not hold them back before the laws of physics start holding them back. There simply does not exist the energy or chip infrastructure to keep doubling CapEx year after year. For that reason, I don't expect this level of spending to be sustained for much longer. We're already starting to see cracks forming where TSMC is not sure about the sustainability of demand and is unwilling to accelerate production investments. Energy infrastructure costs are going through the roof, memory costs are multiplying 4 or 5x just in the last 6 months. This simply cannot go on much longer at this pace due to physical constraints. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and subscribe to help the channel and community grow. This isn't meant to be an AI only channel, but I do have videos planned that apply everything we talked about here to a real-life case study on Microsoft. I also have some videos planned to talk about AI data center profitability, or rather, lack of profitability.